I mean, you're basically just taking that option off the table, right? The option of paying for the decryptor has now been removed as an option, and that doesn't leave you a whole lot of other options, does it? You basically have to recover or rebuild,
Countries are sort of toying with the potential for stopping these payments. Like, we'll just make this illegal. And so you have this like incredible quandary. Am I willing to break the law to save my business?
Hey, look, all that does is drive the majority of the behavior underground. You're not solving the problem.
By day, Kurtis Minder is the CEO and co-founder of GroupSense, a digital risk protection company. Inside that company, he runs the ransomware response practice and is also the lead negotiator on the larger cases that come their way. By night, Kurtis speaks to small businesses pro bono about what they can be doing to protect their data so that companies like his don't have to step in. Andy has invited Kurtis to the Cybercrime Lab to share a few stories as well as the ins and outs of reporting ransomware attacks to the government. This is the Cybercrime Lab, a podcast about true cybercrime stories, the impact on victims, and what businesses can do to protect themselves and their customers. And if you think you're not at risk, that is exactly where attackers want you to be.
In my experience, it only takes hearing what these attacks are like a few times to realize you need to prepare yourself for what could be a business-ending experience.
That's Andy Anderson, the founder and CEO of DataStream Insurance. For over a decade, Andy has been working with victims of cybercrime. He's seen firsthand the human impact of a cyber attack. Now, he's on a mission to shed light on the threats we all face from a world we can't see.
Hey, Kurtis, welcome to the Cybercrime Lab podcast. We've actually had a chance to talk a couple of times, but was excited to have you on this iteration of the show. For those who don't know you, I'd love if you just take a minute and introduce yourself and the firm that you work with.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. Thanks for having me on, Andy. Appreciate it. My name is Kurtis Minder. I'm the CEO and co-founder of GroupSense. It's a digital risk protection company. Inside that company, we have a ransomware response practice that I run. And as part of that, I'm also sort of the lead ransomware engagement / negotiator for a lot of the larger cases that we do.
Yeah. And just to give some people a sense of like your experience and scale, rough numbers, how many do you think your organization has done over its history, total cases?
Definitely hundreds. It does come in ebbs and flows, like it slows down for a while and then it picks back up. But yeah, definitely hundreds of cases, and they vary from, I do a fair amount of pro bono work for free for small businesses, all the way to like multi-million-dollar, publicly traded companies. So we've done and everything in between, basically.
One of the fun things about this podcast is we try and dive into real cases, right? And really what that looks like. So I know we talked about a couple. Why don't we dive into the some of the ones that we discussed before we went live, and we'll go down lots of tangents of that. I have no doubt,
Sure.
Right? So tell us one that you think would be interesting to this audience.
Yeah, I think one of the ones we talked about potentially discussing, and there's been a number of these that we've experienced, but one in particular stands out where the company was a small architectural engineering firm, a small town U.S. firm, used a managed service provider, didn't have in-house IT necessarily, got hit over a holiday weekend. Everything's locked and the backups were destroyed. So they had no meaningful way to recover.
Yeah. And for someone who isn't in that, in that business and experiencing that, like, why was that so problematic? Like, what was that architectural engineering firm concerned about, like, for losing that data?
Well, I'm not an engineer of that ilk, but the documents that they have, the drawings that they have are extremely valuable, not just for the active projects, but for projects that they've worked going back, decades. All those documents are continually referenced over time. As you can imagine, they're building things like bridges and and buildings. And as they make changes to those or maintenance to those, all those documents are extremely important. And on top of that, just being able to operate as a business, not being able to use their CAD machines, their drawing machines, all that stuff.
Yeah. So like literally like they walk in, sometime around the holidays and like nothing turns on, or like, screen of death with like a note on it. What's that like, or what's that call like?
Yeah, I think what was specifically interesting about this story is we didn't get the first call, and that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit. Like a lot of victims, they Googled, forgive me, I forget the ransomware variant that it was. It was a while ago, but they Googled, let's say it was Ragnar Locker. Just for example, they Googled how to decrypt Ragnar Locker, right?
Ragnar's Locker is a type of ransomware that we've seen going around since the end of 2019. It's typically targeted at English-speaking users and has been on the FBI's radar, as it's been involved in the breach of several businesses in critical sectors.
There's a number of companies out there that have paid for the Google AdWords related to these things. And so the first 5 results you're going to get are going to be companies that have paid to be at the top of that search. In this case, one of the companies brands themselves as a data recovery company. And if you go to their website, it claims that they have special software that can decrypt the threat actors' encryptor files without engaging or without speaking to the bad guys. That's not a real thing. That's not a real thing.
So you got whacked by one criminal, and then another criminal is basically piling on.
They're certainly profiteering from the victim. Yeah, they're profiteering from the victim. And so the way that we found out that this was going on, they called us because they said, look, we'd engaged this other company. We gave them a couple of sample files to try. They asked, the data recovery company asked the victim, please send us a couple of files so we can see if our software is going to work on your files. And then they sent those files back decrypted. And so, the victim's excited. They're like, hey, we're going to get out of this, free and clear. And then the data recovery company went silent for a while. Long enough. I'm going to say a while, like a couple days. They weren't returning phone calls. So these guys need to operate as a business. So they kind of figured, hey, these guys are flaky. We got to go someplace else. Then that's when we got the call. And when he was telling me about the data recovery company, I did ask, I said, I think the guy's name was Frank. I said, Frank, did they ask you for the ransom note too? And he's like, yeah, they did. And I was like, do you ever wonder why they need the ransom note? If they have a software that can just decrypt the files, what relevance does the ransom note have for them? And I didn't think about that. And I'm sure on your other episodes, you've talked about how these bad guys operate, the actual ransomware actors. They will do a proof of life process where you can supply them 2 files or 3 files, small, insignificant files, so that they can prove that they can decrypt them. What this company was effectively doing was man-in-the-middling the negotiation and then marking up their decryptors as their own software. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, like they just emailed the actual criminals or the ransomware gang and said, "Oh, okay, take these files and decrypt them," pretending to be somebody working on their behalf, right?
When we logged into the dark web site where we were supposed to interact with the threat actors, the conversation that company had with the threat actors was there. Like we could read the whole thing. And and then the actual data recovery company did call them back somewhere in the middle of our interaction. They called them back and they marked up the number that was on that chat. They had marked it up 80%.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That's wild.
Yeah.
Right.
And
so,
yep.
Yeah. Interesting. And so any idea, okay, so what happens next?
Well, unfortunately, the bad guys don't really differentiate between who they're talking to. So the negotiation, I'm doing the quote things with my fingers, had already occurred. They'd already settled on a number. And there's really no coming on. Like I can't get in there and tell the bad guys like, oh, those other guys were joking around. Let's start over. That doesn't work, right? So now we're in a position where it's like, look, you're either going to have to pay these guys. They have the decryptors, right? So you're either going to have to pay these guys what they're asking, or you're going to have to find a way to recover. And so ultimately we went with plan B instead of paying the hundreds of thousands of dollars that this data recovery company was demanding. They ended up creatively going into their email inboxes and just finding as many of these files that they'd mailed each other and or customers to restore as best they could through that. That's what they ended up doing. Now, I ended up reporting this company, which, by the way, is a U.S.-based company that is still in business. Our team ran into them again this week doing the same thing. I turned them into the FBI. I turned them into CISA. I filed an FTC complaint, and I called the attorneys general of the state that they reside in. So I tried to make sure that people were aware this was going on.
And nothing's happened?
I can't say nothing. I don't know exactly how long these processes take, but the feedback I got from law enforcement was generally that, they get a lot of reports like this. They don't have, the resources to chase it. It does appear that the state's attorneys general of that state is pursuing them in some fashion, but nothing has actually occurred to my knowledge yet.
How about Google?
Oh, good point. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. Allowing them to place the ads. Yeah. Great point.
I would, again, like, another, a few, throats to choke, right?
Right.
Yeah. Like who's actually like, the security team at Google might be, right?
Yeah.
Interesting to police here.
At GroupSense, we know those people. So that's a good idea. That's a call I can make.
Yeah. Ping DuckDuckGo and, I guess people, if you're buying this, you might be on Bing, right? So, call Microsoft. Or maybe the old Yahoo browser, right? Search engine. Ask Jeeves, right? Cover all your bases.
Oh my God.
That's wild.
And I will tell you, I'm focusing in on this one use case and this one company, but there are dozens of companies just like this. We've run into them in Australia, in Europe. So there's a lot of companies basically employing this sort of man-in-the-middle attack. The other comment I'll make is if this company in particular, if you go to their website, they put a lot of statistics up about how they help local law enforcement and municipalities as a sort of a focus for them.
Yeah.
And I can't say in all cases, but we believe that particular victim demographic is attractive or attracted to these companies because it gives them some plausible deniability. We didn't pay the bad guys. We paid this company to do the recovery. Now, they may or may not know that that company went ahead and paid the bad guys, right? Like that was, but it gives them sort of this from a constituency perspective, plausible deniability that they didn't pay a Russian actor or something similar. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, and it's also like, so you need the the idea that you didn't pay the ransom, right? That's interesting. Although, like what's so wild is like literally you got in bed with like fraudsters, right? That's pretty seedy, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's so interesting too, like how you like this is such like a legal, there's a lot of like legal gray areas, right? Here, right?
Sure.
So before we kind of dive into that, let's just talk about like what that, were you involved in the sort of like recovery process, or how did that work? These guys just like, did as best they could and then, tried to move on, right?
Yeah, the extent of our involvement was just coaching them on some of the processes that we've seen other companies do when their backups were destroyed, and the email idea was one of those things. And they were already, I can't take credit for it. They were already digging in, and trying to find the data.
Yeah. Insurance? Did they have any coverage, or they
did not? No, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's what I often see, right? Like it would have been, probably dealt with.
I really feel for these companies of this profile because it's, they don't have the sort of the security IQ or resources, and it's in my opinion, it's not punitive. It's unreasonable to expect that. there's a cyber security talent deficit worldwide. To expect a 30-person architecture firm to have an on-staff cyber expert is just unreasonable to expect that. And they use a local IT shop to do all of their management, and we did help them kind of triage how we believe the threat actors got in. That particular threat actor group was known for RDP exploits, and sure enough, they had opened up some RDP ports for remote employees that had been exploited, unfortunately. Yeah.
RDP stands for Remote Desktop Protocol. These types of electronic pipes feature a security bug that is so easily exploited, practically anyone could potentially hack into it.
Yeah, I mean, again, like it's not, we work with a lot of MSPs, right? And some are good and some are, still catching up. And sometimes they let their, they are too, customer centric and let them do whatever they want and don't hold that line in terms of.
Yeah, and I also empathize with those folks, like the MSP folks, because that again, your customers in that sort of customer demographic and that size, they really are they're small, they're focused on their core business. That's it. Like, just make things work. They don't think about, they don't prioritize to think about what could happen or what might happen. But I do a lot of public speaking on this. I volunteer at chambers of commerce all over the country and talk about what these small businesses can do to protect themselves. And inevitably, every time somebody asks, I mean, it sounds scary, but it's not going to happen to me. And I was like, well,
yeah,
I'm sorry to tell you, man, but like, yes.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, again, like I've seen it so many times, and I even hear it from like the MSPs that we work with, this sort of like desire for, they make perfect the enemy of like good, right? And they're like, well, like, do we have like this, what's our whole like our whole plan for an incident response plan, and we need, have we thought about every single permutation, and like that's probably not going to work for X, Y, and Z, and
right.
And I go and I literally was in having this conversation with an entire conference room of people, right, like a large trade show type conference room, and and that was less than 10 minutes after when we asked how many of you have an incident response plan, and like less than a quarter raised their hand. So it's like you went from like we don't have this at all to like let's build the
right.
and the F-35 strike plane, right? Like how about we just like a paper plane, right? Like, let's just start there.
Baby steps.
Get something flying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, wild. Well, how about, we talked about some other things. Let's talk about the legal gray area, right? Because I think that's something that people are, not as aware of kind of like, okay, what are some of the things that you can step into? Because there's sort of like, there's concerns about like regulation and reporting, and then, there's forensic issues, and like, are you playing a potential terrorist organization? How can someone get a kind of their mind around some of those different regulatory kind of challenges?
Well, it's actually not as complicated as it sounds. I mean, at least I'm talking specifically about U.S. cases here. It is not illegal to pay a ransom unless the like you mentioned, the perpetrator is on the sanctions list, the Treasury Department OFAC sanctions list. I'll get to the reporting part in a section because that is a little bit more nuanced, but that sanctions list is basically, it's a list that you can query. We, as part of our process, like to do a little bit of extra diligence on that. So in addition to just looking on the list, because let's be honest, the Treasury Department is not great at cyber intelligence, right? Like they don't really, these bad guys rebrand all the time, that kind of thing. So we do a little bit of extra legwork there. Part of that is when we do get a wallet address from the threat actor, we'll use crypto tracing tools to determine where it was created, where is it domiciled, what transactions has it done in recent history. So like, for example, if it's in Belgium, but every dollar that goes into it immediately gets transferred to a wallet in Tehran, that's bad. And we'll document and advise the client accordingly. So that it's not really that complicated about the legal parts of it.
Many who find themselves victim to a cyber attack begin to wonder what they're legally allowed to do. One may not think to consult the OFAC, even if it does tend to be outdated, but it's essential to stay within the realms of legality, even if you are the victim. As Kurtis will mention shortly, you want to stay cognizant of where your money could end up, even if the actor isn't on the list. In most cases, you're often better off getting the help of a cybersecurity expert.
That said, I mean, you could be paying, a Russian, actor who's not on the sanctions list, and they could do bad things with your money. So that's more of an ethical question, right?
Yeah.
You don't know what they're doing with the money.
And if they're on the sanctions list, it's like, we can't pay them, right? So what happens then? Then the organization just like, and what happens when like you tell the threat actor that?
You don't. There's no reason to inform them of why you're not paying. In most cases, it's best practice to just cease communications altogether, than to try to have a dialogue about about your legal woes. So yeah, we're not communicating that to the threat actors typically, but I mean, you're basically just taking that option off the table, right? The option of paying for the decryptor has now been removed as an option, and that doesn't leave you a whole lot of other options, does it? You basically have to recover or rebuild, And
it's never, I mean, I guess it's not even worth it saying like, hey, I can't pay you, right? Like, do you want to just, right? Because like, again, like if the OFAC list is public, like it's like, they're going to know, right?
Right. And so that's why you've seen a lot of these groups sort of splinter and rebrand and because they're just avoiding the list, is what they're doing by using branding.
Yeah. Changing. Right. Okay. So, and then how about the reporting side?
So that's definitely evolving a lot. There are now requirements around certain types of companies for them to report this to the SEC and FinCEN.
What's
if
FinCEN?
You're one of those companies, you probably got a letter from FinCEN, right?
What's FinCEN? What is that?
It's part of the SEC's sort of financial police. I'm not an expert on the organization, but and organizations like mine have gotten letters saying, hey, look, if you do these cases, that we need you to report X or Y related to. It's very specific. They're not telling you not to pay. They're saying if you pay, we need all the information. We need to know, what was the impact? When did you get hit? What wallet did you use? What wallet did you pay? All of that stuff has to be documented.
Many people don't think about the reporting aspect of a cyber attack, but it is definitely something worth considering, and one more reason to enlist the help of a professional like Kurtis and his team. The more victims who participate in this reporting practice help to get these threat actors off of the proverbial cyber street. Right
now, the requirements are really around critical infrastructure or companies that are supplying critical infrastructure. I have a problem with the word critical infrastructure because it's like a variable. You can insert whatever you want in there. What is critical infrastructure? Well, frankly, I would argue that small businesses collectively are critical infrastructure, right? Because they make up half the U.S. economy and more than half the jobs, but they're not included in the list. We're talking about people who, make parts for, fighter jets and electrical grid, manufacturers and things like that.
Yep. And we've talked about this before, like there's been moves to sort of like prevent, like in the US, it's still legal to pay these ransoms, and a number of different countries are sort of toying with the potential for stopping these payments, right? Yeah. Which, obviously on first blush seems like, okay, this will end the problem, right? Like we'll just make this illegal, right? But makes this sort of really torturous decision where, like, basically, is the future of your business directly tied to, you doing something illegal, right? And so you have this like incredible quandary between like, am I going to break the, like I as like Joe Q citizen, am I willing to break the law to save my business? It's just like a horrible moral dilemma.
Well, and I mean, I don't want to speak for the victims, but in most cases, yes. Yes. I mean, if you're a small business and you spent, 18 years of your life building like I said, an architectural engineering practice that's very successful, I do a lot of I'll just say a lot. I've spoken to quite a few of the policymakers in Washington, in Senate, and in Congress. I've talked to CISA and the FBI about this. Some of the think tanks, and my narrative has always been, hey, look, all that does is drive the majority of the behavior underground. Yeah. You're not solving the problem, and further, you can't just take away that option and not provide a third option, right? So if your options right now are go out of business or pay a ransom, and you guys say, okay, you can't pay out a ransom, so you're basically telling all of the small businesses that get hit that take one for the team. Like I don't see how that's fair. And so I've been pushing for that. If the government wants to do something, they should have some third option that they can offer a company. Well, maybe that's a subsidized help with the recovery or something like that, right?
Yeah, and I guess what we see now, sort of circling back to like the regulatory piece is like, there's, some of the significant pain associated with these incidents is essentially like government-related fines and penalties, right? And it's sort of like you're just punishing it. You're punishing the victim, right? I mean, like,
agreed.
I guess there are other places where that happens as well. Like, are you so derelict in your duties of managing your stuff that someone was, that the government will punish you because that's, but it's pretty, we're kind of on the edge of our legal system there. But what's your perspective?
I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. I think it just depends on the company. So, you talk about somebody like I shouldn't drop names, but some of the ones that have been on TV, right? Like the ones that you heard about on the news that got hit, these big publicly traded companies, you could argue that maybe fines are appropriate because they do have the responsibility and the resources to do the proper diligent steps to prevent it. And if we can show that they were negligent, that's fair. But what I don't think is fair is the coffee shop, dry cleaner, print shop, architecture firm, to expect them to have the same approach, with no resources available to them is not fair. And that, I don't know how you fix that. I'm just saying, finding those folks is there are no security professionals available to them, right? It's an issue.
Yeah. And I wonder, it makes me think about like the California Consumer Privacy Act, which, has lots of problems, but one of the things that it has is the sort of like, it doesn't kick in until you're, I believe, north of $25 million in revenue, right? Or something like that. I think that's the line. So, you sort of eliminate most of those, truly small businesses that don't have those resources, right? And thinking through, which again, you could do that pretty easily, right? Just putting some floors on where this stuff kicks in, right? As well as giving, resources and guidelines and whatnot. Right?
Yeah. And I don't know where they come up with the floor / ceiling related to the revenues, but I would, just being a cybersecurity professional and interacting with companies of all sizes, I can tell you that a company with $25 million in revenue probably doesn't have a full-time security professional.
Still, yeah, right? Totally.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, again, like that, but it's certainly better than doing this to like a $5 million company, right? Or like you're not going to hit your local laundry, right? You're right. So you're taking out. I mean, we're very aware of like small businesses, right? But also, maybe just to switch gears and we're kind of reaching the end. What would you recommend for folks who are, at this, who unfortunately, this might be in their future, right? Where they're going to get hit with one of these. How do they potentially avoid it? And then how do they, more important than that, how do they maybe minimize the damage or make it so that increase their likelihood of surviving these events with minimal damage, right?
Sure. And, the cyber folks on the listeners will roll their eyes, but I mean, the most effective and least expensive thing you can do is the prevention, which I'm a big fan of. And if you look at how some people believe that these threat actors are executing these super sophisticated attacks. They're really not. Most of them are not sophisticated at all. If you think about the bad guys are running a business effectively on their side, they do have an ROI on their time. So they're gonna take the least expensive and most effective route to compromising a company. And those things are not sophisticated at all. And it typically revolves around, bad passwords and password policy, like super simple stuff. Yep. Not properly securing remote access with like two-factor or not patching those devices or whatever.
Do not underestimate the power of simple prevention, like multi-factor authentication, XDR, cloud backup, and an incredibly important step that Kurtis will mention shortly about why printing out your incident response plan is one of the most important steps you can take.
So, the first thing I would say is there's some basic best practices. I don't have to list them on the podcast. You can Google like what are the 5 things I can do to not get hit by ransomware, and they're super simple. And here's the best part: is most of them don't cost any money. Like they cost a little time. Maybe you might have to learn a new process or strategy, but you don't have to buy anything to make those changes. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is, we were joking about the sophistication of incident response plans. You don't have to have a sophisticated plan, but you should have a plan and have a conversation with your leadership team and about, well, what if, and at least talk through it. I'll throw in a little funny quip though. If you do have a plan, print it out. Because I have been in many cases, a handful where they say, oh, yeah, we paid Deloitte to build this incident response plan. We did tabletop exercises and everything, but it's encrypted with the rest of the files and we don't have it memorized. Yeah. So print it out. Yeah. And then as on the back end, if all this still happens and you're executing your plan, do engage a professional. Usually you can, if you don't know who that is, your cyber insurance company can typically recommend one. Don't try to do a negotiation yourself. We've seen so many of those go bad. The bad guys do know what they're doing. So yeah, and don't Google for your help. Ask your cyber insurance company or your law firm or someone like that if you don't know who to.
Go on one of the panels. Yeah. I mean, again, like you could do worse than like calling one of the panel providers from even if you don't have coverage, right?
Yep.
I mean, and the other thing is, I do think, prevention, but even just a little bit of like resiliency, right? Like, so many of these little businesses, like, $100 in buying, thumb drives that they just like plugged in and did it, once every quarter. Right. And
like
just everything
cold
critical.
Storage. Yeah. Cold offsite storage, something like that. Yeah. Yep.
Like totally like so bare bones. Although, you're probably going to like hit all the alarm bells for like you're stealing data from us, right? Like you gotta make sure that
there's a whole DLP component to that.
Right. Yeah. It gets complicated. Well, Kurtis, if people want to find more of your stuff, where would they, how would they do that?
Sure. So my day job is GroupSense. So that's groupsense.io, GroupSense.io. And then my personal site is kurtisminder.com. And I do a lot of public speaking. I do a lot of pro bono work. So, if you want me to come talk to your organization about how to protect yourself in one of these cases, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. Well, this is awesome, Kurtis. Great to kind of hear the stories and hear what you're doing. And I feel like we touched on a lot of stuff. So this is great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cyber Crime Lab, brought to you by DataStream Insurance. When the worst happens, you're going to want the best financial, legal, and technical support to get you back up and running again. With cyber insurance from DataStream, we find the most comprehensive insurance coverage on the market alongside critical post-incident customer support. Go to datastreaminsurance.com today and see how we can help you secure your business data. That's datastreaminsurance.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star review. You'll find show notes and any resources mentioned at cybercrimelabpodcast.com. We hope you'll join us next episode. Until then, stay safe. More importantly, stay ready.